So, so we're gonna talk about some of that. I'm gonna share my screen real quick so you guys can see all the fun stuff. So really what I'm gonna go through tonight is kind of a set of guides or principles. We're not going to talk necessarily about, or I'm not going to talk necessarily about specific pests, but I hope you all brought questions about your specific pest problems, and there should be plenty of time to answer those throughout. If you do have a question during the presentation, if you could put it in the chat box. Hopefully everyone found the chat on their the bottom bar of their Zoom there. And then I'll monitor those throughout and answer them as we go. But just to kind of keep things tidy, we'll start with questions in the chat. But anyway, so these are the things I'm going to talk about as ways to help keep pests out. If you have specific things we can talk about, you know, because we all have pests, right? They get in. And so we can talk about some specifics to a particular pest problem if you have those questions. So the first thing is to plant the right plant in the right place. So this is prevention, right? The first step for any pest management program is going to be prevent that pest from occurring in the first place. And that means getting the right plant in the right sun situation, the right moisture requirements, and then paying attention to surrounding landscaping and hardscaping. So we see a lot of leaf burn from shade plants that are planted in sunny situations like what's happening in this hosta here. A lot of those come into my office and it's like, well, it's just getting too much sun and the plant's not used to it. The same thing with this juniper up top. This is a drier loving plant that's planted in really excessively moist soil, and so it's not able to thrive in that in those conditions. Both sun and moisture for the wrong plant or in the wrong quantities for a particular plant stresses them out and can actually make them more susceptible to other pests in the future. So not only are there problems with the conditions themselves, then they're a lot more susceptible to other things too. And then one thing that we have to think a lot about here especially is things like de-icers. So in the bottom here we have some shrubs that were damaged. The brown foliage on the bottom there, those were damaged by the application of some de-icing material along that sidewalk. So when you're if you're at a point where you're adding new plants, these are all really good things to think about. Think about what is going to be surrounding that plant, whether it's some kind of feature like a driveway or a sidewalk that you might de-ice, or the foundation of your house where that plant might grow so large that you start to get problems from roots around the foundation, or even other surrounding landscaping. So are you planting something that's going to get really big and start to crowd out maybe some other slower growing smaller plants, or anything like that? I mean, you can always divide, and we'll talk about that later too, but just take into consideration some of these things that might affect the overall health of the plant. So in line with putting the right plant in the right place from the beginning is to make sure that we're providing those plants with good care. So we want to start with good planting practices. Again, if this is something that you are adding now or installing now, making sure that you're planting it correctly, giving it plenty of space to grow, and things like that are going to be really beneficial in the long term for the health of that plant. So up top here we have a root ball for a container grown tree that was really just growing in a pot for too long, and that had started to train those roots to grow in a circular pattern around that pot. We call those circular roots. And that can cause a lot of problems for this this tree in particular, for a couple of reasons. One is when the roots are all balled up like that, they're not providing that anchoring structure that we need from roots for things like trees and shrubs. And so they just grow in this mass versus growing out and away from the tree and giving it a really good solid footing in the soil. Another problem that this can cause is as that trunk gets bigger, those roots can actually start to tighten up around the trunk itself and cause girdling of the trunk. So we want to avoid that. One of the ways is to check your container grown material before you purchase it and look for signs of this type of growth in the roots. Sometimes this can be relaxed a little bit. And so if you buy something and you take it out of the pot and it looks a little bit like the roots are starting to circle, you can soak that in water for a little bit and loosen up that soil and try and loosen up all those roots and get them to kind of grow out and spread out in a little bit better fashion. Then this is really most important for our perennial plants. It's not as big of a deal for annual plants, but for our perennials, especially our woody perennials, this type of growth is really important. And then also planting it so that those roots can grow out versus keeping the roots all clumped together. We want to give them a good start when planting. We also want to do good water management. So similar to planting a dry loving plant in really wet soil, we also don't want to overwater and we don't want to underwater. This is, an art and a science. So you kind of have to be in tune with your plant, know the plant's water requirements, and check the soil. So if the soil looks moist or squishy, obviously water is probably not going to be necessary. If the plant starts to look a little wilty, that's not necessarily an indication that it needs water. It could be an indication that it has too much water too. So those two conditions look very similar in plants, unfortunately. So just water when the soil is dry, like the top 1 to 2 inches, and keep an eye on your plant, monitor it throughout the season. We also want to make sure that we're managing the nutrients. Oftentimes when we talk about nutrients, we talk about nutrient deficiency, and that can be just the natural state of the soil could just be deficient in a nutrient, and that looks a certain way in plants. We can also get nutrient deficiencies when something else is out of balance, and so it prevents the plant from taking up a nutrient that's already there. And so if you think you might have a nutrient problem, I would recommend starting with a soil sample or a soil test to test what nutrients are in your soil. We have a couple of publications on doing a soil sample and having it tested, and we have resources available to help with interpreting that information. That's really all I will say about soil samples, because there's certainly other people in Extension that are way more qualified to talk about that than I am. But it can be really important in, again, providing that good care. We're giving our plants the best possible starts. And when they are otherwise stressed from something, even if it is a nutrient deficiency or a water issue, they're going to be more prone to other pests like insects and disease. The flip side of the nutrient coin is we can give our plants too much nutrients. So excess nitrogen in a plant can actually attract certain like leaf and foliage feeding insects. It can also be really beneficial to certain diseases and their proliferation within a plant. So we not only want to think about or have to think about nutrient deficiency, we also don't want to just broadcast fertilizer in our garden, because we could end up with problems from too much nutrients as well. So that's why I say provide good care, but not too much. We don't want to overwater. We don't want to over fertilize, because we can love our plants too much sometimes. If you guys don't mind, I'm going to turn my video off just to save hopefully some bandwidth, but I'll turn it on for questions. So the next thing I wanted to touch on is this know your enemy. So one of the keys to keeping pests out is to know what pests there are and what they look like. So if you do find them, you can manage them appropriately. There's a really nice guide, Insects of South Central Alaska. It's not comprehensive for everything we have, but it is a really great start, and it has a lot of good things, or a lot of good information in there. And while while it is Insects of South Central Alaska, it is not restricted to South Central. There are certainly insects in there that are going to occur in other parts of the state too. So if you're somewhere else, there's certainly valuable information in that book as well. One guide that I like a lot is this Garden Insects of North America. This is more textbook size and shape, whereas Insects of South Central Alaska is more of a field guide size and shape of a book. But Garden Insects of North America was written by an extension professor from Colorado State University, and it has a lot of fantastic information in it. Great pictures, great information about different things. Because it's kind of from a Colorado perspective, it's going to have a few more insects than what we would normally find here in Alaska, but it's still a really great resource for gardeners here as well. So I highly recommend that. It's pretty inexpensive. I think you can get it for about $20 on Amazon, and there is a second edition for it in case you go looking for it. There are two editions. I haven't looked at the second edition yet, but I'm sure it's just slightly better than the first edition. So if you do find something and you can't determine what it is, it's maybe not in a guidebook or anything like that, please reach out to Extension. We are here to help with that. This website here, pestreporter.alaska.edu, that takes you to a form that we have on our website where you can fill out just a couple of quick pieces of information like your name and contact information, and then you can upload some photos of what pest you found, and that sends it directly to our IPM program. I work in our IPM program, and we can help you figure out what it is, and we can help you figure out what to do about it if something needs to be done about it. So please reach out. If you don't want to fill out the form online, feel free to call any of our offices, and we can help you out that way as well. So take some time. If you're an experienced gardener, you probably know some of the things that commonly come up in your garden. If you're just starting this year, or if this is, if you're still within your first few years of gardening, maybe you haven't seen it all yet, but do take some time to learn about what some of those pests might be, and what you might encounter when you're working in the garden. So you want to know your pests, or you want to know your enemies, but you also want to know your enemy's enemy. And those tend to be what we call our beneficial insects. So they're the predators, the parasitoids, the things that are going to eat what could be causing problems. So those same guides that I mentioned before are going to have information about beneficial insects. The Garden Insects of North America has a whole section on beneficials. And so that's, again, a great resource. Sometimes you see an insect on a plant and it could be unclear whether it's a good insect or a bad insect or a neutral insect. So take some time to learn about what different beneficials are out there. The pictures here this is a ladybird beetle larva feeding on an aphid. Ladybird beetles are also called ladybugs. This is the immature stage, but they are predators both as immatures and adults. This guy right here, this is a ground beetle. They're also predators as immatures and adults. Ground beetles are really common. They like cool, moist, hidden places. So a lot of times you find them if you're moving stones or turning over logs or something like that. I tend to get a lot of calls about them because they come into people's garages or basements. If they're inside, they're not a problem. They're just looking for a warm place to hang out. But in the garden and in the yard, they're really, really beneficial. They'll feed on a lot of different things, including slugs, I will say. That tends to be the thing that really captures people's attention with ground beetles, is that they can do some slug control. And then on the bottom here, this is a lacewing. They're also predators, both as adults and immatures, feeding on aphids and thrips and a variety of other small insects. So if you ever see an insect eating another insect, it's usually best to leave them be, because that is doing you a lot more good than potential harm. And so we kind of want to keep these things in balance and let that insect have its meal, even if it's something that you think is otherwise, beneficial or good. It's the overall good that you're getting by having the predator around in general is outweighs, for instance, the butterfly or whatever that it might be feeding on. Not to get too much of a bummer early on. So the next kind of idea I want to talk about is to be prepared. This is, again, we can't prevent every single thing from happening, but we can be prepared for things that we think might happen. So when we're talking about pests in our gardens, it's monitor early and monitor often. So we're all out doing a variety of tasks, whether it's watering or weeding or just going out to see how much they've grown that day. While you're out there, check for unusual signs on the foliage, or check for unusual damage, and make note of it. A garden journal is a great way to do that. Keep notes. You will thank yourself in the future because you'll have that record. You'll be able to say, oh, every mid-June I start to see aphids on my kale or whatever. But you'll have that record. You'll be able to refer back to it. And it can be a really useful tool in the long run. So monitor, monitor, monitor. And you can do that in a variety of ways. Visual inspections are probably what most of us are going to be doing in our home yards and gardens. And that's, again, those things that we observe when we are out weeding or watering or whatever task we're doing in the garden. You can do some trapping. These yellow sticky traps can be really helpful and useful in like greenhouse situations. They can help both monitor. They're not really great management tools, so they're not going to trap out a pest, but they can help monitor for its presence. They're also, these kinds of sticky traps are also useful in like larger scale production situations. So we've used them in peony fields and other situations like that. They could be useful in a home garden, but they're maybe a little overkill for that, unless you just have a really robust garden, in which case, I mean, that's great and they will be very useful. You can also use a trap like this one down here. This is a slug trap. So if you know you have a consistent slug problem or a moist and shady area, this might not be a bad thing to look into. Again, it will help you determine when they're present, when they're active, when in terms of the time of year, not necessarily the time of day or anything, but when they start to be active during the season. It's not going to solve the problem or trap them out in any way, though it can help reduce the population, but it's more of a monitoring tool. So if we're monitoring, we're also planning. Other ways to kind of help prevent pests from becoming established is having a plan for if you do get something, being able to respond to it quickly, but also having a plan to hopefully decrease the probability of something establishing in the first place. So one of those ways would be through crop rotation. So this is pretty specific to a vegetable garden. You want to rotate what you're planting in different beds or in different parts of the bed so that you can't get a buildup or don't get a buildup of a particular pest in that particular area. So things that are feeding on leaves aren't going to be feeding on roots, and things that can be pests of legumes might not be pests of root crops. So as we kind of rotate through those and move those to different areas, we're not allowing that pest or that crop-specific pest to build up. So that can be a good tool. This diagram here kind of shows a decent rotation. So you'd plant something leafy, then you'd plant a legume, then you'd plant a root crop, and then you'd plant some kind of fruit crop. Fruit meaning, zucchini, tomatoes, strawberries, whatever. And then you would circle back to leaf. And that's going to allow most of our pests to not build up enough in a particular area to cause problems. Another thing to plan is under certain circumstances, you can plan for planting varieties that are going to be more resistant to certain pests. We more so think about this as disease resistance more so than insect resistance. So this tomato seed packet here lists a few different diseases that this particular variety is resistant to. We also think of resistance with respect to plants that aren't necessarily attractive to moose. So that's another thing to think about. Again, if you're adding something to the garden, to think about, well, is it going to be in a place where it could be fed on by moose, and is it going to be the type of plant that they are really interested in feeding on? So the other thing about planning is to plan your starts. So if you're direct seeding into the soil, if you're producing your own starts, or if you are bringing in starts, to make sure that they have the best chances and that they're as clean and healthy as possible. So especially if you're bringing in starts from somewhere, plan to give them a very thorough inspection before you plant them, so that you're not bringing something in like aphids or thrips, any more so than are already present in the environment, into your garden bed, and specifically to that plant itself, which could fail to thrive if it were heavily infested with something that then was able to really establish in that garden bed. So another part of planning can be exclusion. So we're going to try and prevent some things by not bringing them in the first place, and we're going to try and exclude things if we can. So I mentioned, thinking about plants that are less attractive to moose. We can also exclude them with fencing, them and other vertebrate pests. So this is an apple tree. So they put some pretty heavy duty fencing around it to keep, in this case it was deer away, but we would do something similar for moose. In Alaska, we also sometimes need to consider putting some kind of protection around the base of trees and shrubs to protect them from vole damage. So voles will come in and they'll chew on the base of the bark of the tree or shrub, and that can cause girdling and can cause that plant to die. Things more specific to a vegetable garden would be the use of like a cardboard tube here to protect from cutworms. So cutworms are small caterpillars, and they crawl along either the top of the soil surface or just beneath the soil, and they'll chew all around the base of the stem of the plant, and that causes the entire above ground part of the plant to collapse. And so even just using something as simple as this cardboard tube that's buried about 2 inches below the soil surface and sticks up above the soil surface about 2 inches can be really helpful at keeping cutworms away from the base or away from the stem of the plant and being able to feed on it. A similar type of collar down here is a flat collar, and it's placed around the base of plants to prevent, in this particular case, to prevent root maggot adults from laying their eggs on the soil surface. So they lay their eggs on the soil surface, those eggs hatch, and they crawl towards the roots or the base of that plant and feed, and that can cause a lot of problems. This type of collar is meant to prevent those eggs from being laid that close to the plant, so they're less likely to actually attack that plant, or the immatures are less likely to be able to actually find the roots. These can be somewhat effective, but they have their own kind of pros and cons. If you can see, the slits are really, really close to the base of the plant, so this is something you have to be really careful with, both installing and removing, so that you don't damage the main stems of the plant, and also so that over the season the plant doesn't outgrow it essentially, or grow into those cut areas and further cause damage to the plant. So on the same topic of exclusion, we also can use row covers to exclude pests in situations where we know that there is absolutely none of that pest in that bed. Row covers can be a little tricky because in some situations they may limit our access to do other things and to monitor in there. But if you're converting a plot to a new garden bed, it can be helpful to keep some of our pests out. But the minute that you notice that there's a pest in there, you want to remove that row cover so you don't trap them in essentially a buffet. But you want to make sure that you get that open so that you can take care of the pest, and that they're not essentially just holed up in a grocery store of their own, feeding and doing what they do. So. All right, so we can plan to not bring things in, and we can plan to exclude what we can exclude, but we are, for the most part, gardening in really open environments. Things are going to move in, things are going to move out. It's nature, it happens. So at some point you will get pests, and you might have to pick your battles. So this is a good time to think about, because we're just in the start of the growing season. We're making decisions about what's going into the garden. If we haven't planted already, we're making decisions about where things are going and what our goal for them is. So it's also a good time to think about, if you are to get pests, what you are willing to tolerate. So not to pick on aphids too much, but in some situations, aphids are just there doing their thing, and they're not worth the trouble to treat. So early in the season, we often see a lot of aphid feeding on the stems of willow and cottonwood, and they might produce some honeydew that might get on some lower plants, but overall it's not really causing much harm or damage, and so I wouldn't really recommend that anything needs to be done for that. However, if you see a giant mass of aphids on your fireweed that you were intending to use for jelly, that's a different situation. So those are different, same pest, but different situations where you may or may not tolerate that pest's presence on that particular plant. So think about what your uses of the plants are. If they're just visual, you know, if it's your flower garden, might be different than how much you would tolerate something in your vegetable garden. So another thing to consider about how much damage you can or can't tolerate would be to also know what that means for the future. So the pest here is the imported currant worm, and this is a caterpillar-like insect. It's not a true caterpillar, and they feed on the leaves of currant and gooseberry plants, and they can really just completely defoliate a plant in a pretty short amount of time. But often the first year or two, their presence may go largely unnoticed because they're in really small numbers, or you might see just a little bit of leaf feeding damage and not think too much of it. And then the next year, because those individuals have have thrived, they've had a great meal, they spent a great winter snuggled up in the soil, the next spring they emerge and they're able to lay a lot of eggs, and those eggs can do a lot of damage. So if you see something and you choose not to make a management decision about it, just know that could lead, not always, but it could lead to higher populations of that same pest in the coming years that might cause more problems for your plant, or be harder to treat in the future. So do know what you can tolerate, but also keep in mind that things can populations can get higher, and that can cause some other problems too. Pick your battles, but also pick the fruits of your labor. So leaving produce, again, this is kind of more specific to that vegetable garden side of things. Leaving produce to over-ripen can cause some problems. I'm sure we've all missed that strawberry when we're picking strawberries and you come back 3 days later and you're like, well, how did this moldy strawberry get here? And that is, one of those things that you overlook one and all of a sudden it's mushy and brown. But this is gray mold, and that can really run through a bed pretty quickly if you're not pulling some of this out of there. All that gray stuff is going to have spores in it that can infect other plants in the area. So make sure that you're not leaving produce to over ripen as best you can. I will be the first to admit that I am notoriously bad for missing that random strawberry in the bed. But we just do the best we can, right? Same thing for other types of fruits and attracting wasps. So wasps really like that overripe fruit. We've seen them in strawberries, raspberries, and pretty much anything that grows. They'll go in there. They're going after largely the liquid inside them, but they can cause problems because you're not really able to eat that fruit when it's heavily fed upon, and also there's the human health hazard of trying to garden amongst the wasps. All right, so the last thing that I wanted to really quickly touch on, and then we can get to all of the questions, is to tidy up. So this is something that is a mid-season and late season task. If you're really gung-ho, you might do a little weeding early on as things start to come up, but keep your beds weeded, control weeds in surrounding areas too. A lot of our insects will overwinter or will hang out in surrounding vegetation, not necessarily on the plant that they're gonna be causing the most problems for. So keeping that keeping those weeds down and controlling weeds in all of those areas is going to be really helpful for keeping pests out generally and keeping them from having places to overwinter and helping keep populations low for the next year. So do your weeding and also clean up garden debris. So in the fall or spring, make sure that you're removing all of that plant material. For a lot of our vegetable garden pests, I would recommend doing that in the fall. You don't want those things to overwinter. So I've briefly mentioned root maggots a couple times. Leaving the host plants of root maggots in the garden itself can really let those populations grow and get out of control. So in the fall, remove all your brassicas, all of your carrots that maybe you didn't end up harvesting or whatever, but all of that stuff should come out. And a lot of times our above ground foliage is a great place for some of our pests to overwinter too. So for some of our perennial plants, cut those back in either fall or spring, whatever is going to work best for their growing cycles, and remove that from the garden. In some cases, if you know that it has a pest, whether it's insect or disease, I would not recommend composting that material, because often our compost in Alaska doesn't get hot enough to kill those things. And so that would be a bag and trash that material versus compost it. Compost your healthy plant material, but keep some of the pests out of your compost if you can. So those are my tips for keeping your unwanted guests out of your garden. Like I said, I'm happy to answer all kinds of questions. I will stop sharing and we can kind of have a chat if that works for folks.
So Jesse, do you want people to write their questions in the chat box, or would you like them to just unmute themselves and ask that way? What's your preference?
If people want to type them in the chat, that's great. If you're more comfortable unmuting and asking them yourself, I'm kind of okay with both.
Sounds good. So at this time, we welcome your questions.
So there's a question from Eve about tidying up. Is it okay to leave brassica roots and stems in place to not disturb roots and soil community? So yeah, there's a couple of things. In general, if you have brassica roots, if you have brassicas planted, I would just recommend removing them for the root maggot issue. In terms of soil community, that's a really important and valid question. If you're pretty sure you don't have root maggots, you probably could leave them in there, but once you get root maggots, you can't they're really hard to get rid of. And so that's the kind of pros and cons that you'll have to weigh for your specific garden. I'm not trying to be evasive or not give a straightforward answer, but it's really a personal choice in that regard. It's just, root maggots are terrible and I don't want anybody to have them or have to deal with them. So my preference would be to take that material out of there. If you can get some active compost going and replace some of that in the fall over the winter, that would be a good option when you're removing those roots. Yeah. So there's a question about having too many slugs, how to discourage them. And another one about slug control. with eggshells. So slugs are really difficult to control as well, and a lot of slug control can be accomplished through habitat manipulation. So they like those moist, cool environments. So if you can open anything up and decrease the amount of shade it gets, that will be helpful. That's not always practical for a lot of our gardens. So there's some things that you can do with trapping. Not the kind of trap that I showed initially, but you can use as simple as a piece of plywood on the ground in areas where you see a lot of slugs, and in the morning go out, flip it over, scrape all the slugs off, dunk them in soapy water, put the thing back, put the plywood back down, and do that several days in a row. It's not a very elegant control technique, but it does work, and it can help to reduce some of the populations. Other things that can help are tilling your soil, or working the soil in the spring, and that helps to bring some of those slug eggs to the soil surface where they will dry out or be exposed to predators or other just adverse weather conditions. Eggshells can be effective. They need to be ground pretty well, and this would be, there's a question about cooked or raw. I don't think it would matter. It's about the sharpness of the shells, being able to cut and puncture the slugs. There's not a lot of encouraging research that shows that that's a super effective method, but there is some. And so if you have available eggshells, I would recommend it. You don't want them to be, you know, like big chunks, but you don't want it to be a fine powder, somewhere kind of in between there. The question about the insect guide recommendations. Yeah, so at the beginning I mentioned there's a book called Insects of South Central Alaska. That's a really good resource. And then I also like the Garden Insects of North America. I'll put those titles and authors in the chat too, so that they're written down. Tussock moth caterpillars and gnome. Any suggestions? So that's a tough one because they tend to be really broad feeders. They're not like a specific garden pest. We can find them on alders, willows, all of those types of plants. If they're in a garden bed area, they can be hosed off. A lot of our stuff can just be simply hosed off, and it's not, I mean, it's not gonna kill a lot of them, and some of them may crawl back, but they are going to be exposed to a lot of predation there. They're going to be exposed to being stepped on. They're going to be exposed to other, you know, animals like birds and things like that that might want to eat them, not just insect predators. It can also limit their just like the nutrition that they're able to get. So if they're feeding and they're knocked off, and they're feeding and knocked off, they are going to have a lot harder time completing their life cycle. So that's an option if you want to try something a little stronger. Something like an insecticidal soap will be effective against caterpillars, and that is going to be best on like the youngest, like the smallest of the caterpillars. And then there's some other products too if you're interested in that, but that one's a hard one just because they are such a natural part of our environment versus being just like a really specific you know, produce pest or something like that. Does diatomaceous earth help discourage slugs? Again, it can. The problem or the drawback of diatomaceous earth is that once it's wet, it's not really effective anymore. So it has to be dry to be effective against insects or slugs. And when it dries out, or sorry, when it gets wet, it's also another thing that relies on puncturing or cutting the exoskeleton. When it comes to insects, the when it gets wet, it loses that ability to do that. And so slugs tend to be in wet environments. So it can help so long as it stays dry, but the minute it rains or the minute you water, you're going to have to reapply the diatomaceous earth. Something that can help for slugs is copper tape or copper mesh. So they don't like moving across metal because it interacts with the slime that they excrete as they're moving. That can be pretty pricey because copper, but it can be really, really helpful. But if once they're in the bed, it's not going to be helpful anymore. So it's going to keep them out so long as they're not already there. But once they're in, they're in. Any other questions?
Jesse, I'm wondering, with the spruce beetle kill trees, when's the best time to cut those? And like, is it too late to cut them now? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so beetle kill, the best time to remove those is in anytime between late fall and early spring. So we are a little too late because we're getting close to the adult beetle flight period. And fresh cuts can be attractive to those adults. So we want to minimize bringing in, more than what's already there. So if you have to do a removal, if you can wait until later in the summer, sometime Augustish and later, that's best. However, we all recognize that sometimes you do what you can when you can, and if you have to remove them now, the best thing to do is to fully process that material, either drop the tree and completely remove it from the property and grind down the stump, or drop the tree, completely debark it if you want to save that material for firewood. But really the goal is to make it as poor potential host material for other beetles as possible. And simply having that big fresh cut stump can be attractive to things. So a lot of it is about protecting unattacked standing trees in the area too. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
So I will apologize if I did not spell Dominique Colette's name correctly because it wasn't right in front of me, but the two guidebooks that I recommended at the beginning I've listed them in the chat. Any other questions? It's kind of a quick and dirty on preventing pests or keeping them out. If you do find something, you're always welcome to call or email. We can talk about a variety of different control options. Depending on the pests, some things are going to be more effective. Ooh, in terms of sending samples for ID, Kathy, great question. Under normal circumstances, yes. However, our office is closed right now and we're not accepting mail. I mean, all of our offices are closed around the state, but we're at the library in Anchorage, which is now the Emergency Operations Center, and so we're not getting mail at our office. Hopefully in a couple weeks, months, I don't know, we'll be able to get mail again. But yeah, someday. Right now, pictures kind of have to suffice.
Yeah, in the meantime, you can send your pictures. Jesse, can you type in that?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. So if you guys do have a pest that you want identified, take a really good picture and then send it to this place that Jesse has just put into the chat box, and they'll be able to help you identify your pest.
Yeah, it's pest reporter, all is one word, .alaska.edu. And you're also welcome to email me directly too. That's fine. I love getting pictures in the email.
And I have to say, she's great at identifying pests. I've sent many pests her way, and I haven't stumped her yet.
Well, I appreciate that, Melissa. I enjoy the chase, and I'm not afraid to reach out to the experts too. So we get a lot of assistance in Alaska. We have a lot of good partners at the museum in Fairbanks as well that help us out, and we do as much as we can. And yes, if you're going to email or send something in through the pest reporter, as much information about what you found and where and what it was doing is very, very welcome. Otherwise, you'll probably get a response email with all of those questions in it. A lot of the times that context is so important. So thank you, Kathy, for bringing that up. I look forward to seeing your spider. Oh, 2 years ago, huh?
It was a big orange orb weaver that my son had found down on one of the islands. It was a big monster, and
I remember now.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, the orb weavers are very striking for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, don't be shy. If you have any more questions, feel free to ask. Our time is coming to an end.
Well, I will say I appreciate people taking the time this evening to join us. I know it's, well, at least earlier today it was gorgeous outside and got a little cloudy and windy, but as we get into spring, the pull to be outside is pretty hard to ignore. So I appreciate you guys taking some time to hang out this evening and chat. And like I said, if you have any questions at any time, feel free to reach out.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jesse, for your information and for your availability. And we have a lot of more great classes scheduled Tuesdays and Thursday evenings at 6 p.m. So for the month of May. So if you guys are interested, check out our Facebook page events, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for joining us.